Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Pavelka, and I am a faculty member for the Compass PTN. Excited you could join us today for a little bit of information on data working for change, and really talking about populations, sampling, and how we do our work. So let's go ahead and get started. So, hi everyone again. Let's go ahead and get started. So our objective today, talk a little bit about population and how we can use data within that for help on projects. Also talking about organization of future trials, maybe how you're going to work with some sampling pieces. And then last but not least, what kind of data do we want for our teams and what kind of help can this provide? Now, this isn't going to be a statistical presentation, so don't panic. There won't be a ton of statistics. We're going to talk a little bit about it and how they can help, but in general, some general high overview pieces. So let's get started. Talk about populations. One of the things that we want to think about is when we have a project that we want to work on, we need to have a population of people that that project will help. And so let's talk about what is a population and how do we maybe choose it. And if we can't use all of the population, how can we use maybe a portion of it? So first of all, we have to think about with populations is that we have to think about our strategy and our mission of the organization. And so a couple of good quotes here. Culture eats strategy for lunch from Peter Drucker. So we clearly get that not only do we have to think about the strategy of the organization, but we also need to think about maybe the culture of the organization. So are we used to looking at change? Do we have an influence with the folks that we are talking to about change? The other thing is no money, no mission. So as important as our mission is to help people, the patients that we serve, it is also incredibly important to have some sort of financial return on these projects. And so we need to delicately balance this between mission and margin. And one of the things you want to think about is we really have to instill that, yes, it's important for quality and safety, but at the end of the day, we do need to continue to focus on a little bit of finance as well. So when you start to go in and select a particular project or look for things to start with your teams, don't forget that mission, the vision, the values, and the strategic balance. But we also want to look at and reflect on how does that problem statement affect what we're working on. So what's the scope of our project? How big? How much do we want to try to tackle? And so a problem statement, it very clearly states on why this is an important piece to both maybe strategic and our mission. We also need to think that our projects will probably relate to each other. In other words, there's times when we may say we can only get to so much, or we need to focus on a piece of that right now. And that's fine, but we have to understand that projects do relate to each other, and there may be a time when we need to say, wait a minute, that needs to wait, or that goes with another project. So again, a population. Population defined is a group of individuals that are representative of a category, and it can be of a larger group. So for example, it makes sense, population of a state, population of a town. But we also may want to define population a little bit smaller. So think of maybe, obviously, a community or a county could be a population, but we may want to define it with a panel or a group of our patients that come into our organization. We also may want to define a population as patients with a certain chronic disease. So maybe it's those heart failure patients or patients with diabetes. And those are fine populations to understand and to categorize as well, too. Say that the population is really large, though, and we know that we're not going to be able to get information from 2,000 people or whatever it may be. We may want to take a sample. And so a definition of sample is a portion from a population in which we choose to study that has certain attributes of the whole population. So, for example, maybe it's of an age. The 21 to 25 represents all of those individuals that are in the early stages of their life. And so you think about a sample is, again, a portion of your larger population, but yet still represents the larger population. So how do we select a sample? A question that comes to me all the time, and many times it's difficult to really say what should be the exact number, but here are some questions that may help you when you start to select a sample. The first thing you want to think about is when you start to select a number is what are some characteristics of the population? So again, if I'm studying all the patients in my panel, if I would just look at the 21 to 25-year-olds, it's probably not going to represent the cares and the needs of my entire population within my panel. We also want to look at what are the location and the time period in which you're studying. So is it, a convenience sample where you collect data for 6 months because that's what's available? And so that's important to think about that location and how much time you have to collect as well. We also want to think about the type of sampling technique, and we'll talk about that in a minute when it comes to sampling types. But in all, we would hope that the sampling would help us eliminate a bias within our organization. So what are we doing that may sway us or make a decision with wrong information? So we want to think about our sampling techniques. So there's a couple different larger categories of sampling techniques. The first one is non-probability, and these are samples that are completely not random, and they may have some bias. These are convenience samples. So maybe it's going to a focus group that's already established, or going in and saying, I'm going to pull from a group of our patient family engagement group because we know they're engaged and they're going to give us honest answers. So those are not random. They have already, either been conveniently assembled, or you're already having that type of information. Maybe it's already information that you already have, that you're not going to go on and collect new stuff. So those do come with bias. They're perfectly fine that they come with bias, but you just need to know that depending upon your decision you're making, again, your problem statement, you may not want to do a non-probability because it does interject bias. On the other hand, as long as you're not making really life-changing or life-altering decisions, it's probably okay to just go to a convenience sample. The other type of sampling are the probability samples, and these are the samples that are completely random. So there's 3 different types of random sampling. The first one is a simple random, and this would be like if you threw all of your names in the hat of all of your patients and you're going to draw out 25. Everybody has the same chance of being selected. We can also have stratified, which is really you're going to take your population and you're going to group them. So a very common one is stratified by gender, male, female. And then we draw from maybe each of those groups. So 25 from the males and 25 from the females. So you know you're going to end up with 50 people, but you know that it's split between males and females, or split between those 2 groups, or strata. The last sampling technique is systematic. And this is probably an easy way to do it now that we have electronic mediums like Excel, where you're going to put everybody in, say it's on an Excel spreadsheet, so list everybody's names out. And then you're going to pick say in this case, our patients, or that population that falls at an even systematic number. So the 10th person, so you draw 10, 20, 30, you draw the person or the sample that would fall at that particular number. So maybe it's every 5th as an example. So think about those different sampling techniques. Excuse me. The next thing is when we think about now that we have our population and even potentially a sample, we need to think about what are we going to do with that? How do we use that information in future trials? Well, the first thing you got to think about is what's the expectation of the trial? What are our goals? And don't forget that our goals should be written in SMART format, so specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timed. We need to figure out, from this, what do we want to gain? What do we want to study? We also need to think about that there's lots of statistical tools. I'm not going to go into many of them today, but you need to think about that there are different ways to analyze the performance within your sample or even within your population. And so just know those tools are out there. There's cheat sheets and help guides to be able to, pick which one's the right one. But just know that there are out there, and that you want to use a different one depending upon how you are going to look at the population performance. And then the last thing is, are you going to use it for comparative? And again, there's different ways to benchmark your performance against others. So not just where analysis is your own, but benchmarking is looking outside of that and comparing it to others. So we know where we're going. We know that there's going to be different tools to get there, and now we need to think about selecting an actual measure. So again, a goal that we're going to look at and say, did we achieve what we expected? There's 4 different types of measures that can be possible for our teams. They are structure measures, so in other words, that changes the environment. Performance or process measures. So in other words, we're going to change something in how we do the work. And the last 2, outcome measures. These are often the results that happen within our population. So in other words, did the patients get better? And then last but not least, the outcome of the satisfaction or experience. In our case, it's the patient experience. So we really want to select a measure, and later on we're going to talk about a balance, but a key learning early, and then I'll repeat it again later, is that we want to think about selecting measures that have a good balance, not just 1 or 2 of these areas, but are throughout, maybe have multiple different measures. And so we're not just leaning heavily in one of these buckets. So we have a topic of our measurement, and again, written in a SMART goal. We want to think about creating measures around safety, effectiveness, patient-centered, timely, efficient, equitable. So our measures should relate this, so really move our organization forward in value and quality, and be able to improve that satisfaction along the way. We also want to think about that the measures can help our effectiveness of clinical quality or clinical care, And so having that opportunity to develop those measures with these in mind, and again, categories within these. And so what are we doing that creates, or what are we going to reach for that creates an effective piece? And then last but not least, when we think about creating a measurement, we need to know that we can actually pull that data out of our system. So is it going to be manually compiled data? Might work if you have a very small sample. But if you even still have 100 in your sample, imagine collecting all that data. So we want to make sure that our data collection system, how we're going to pull it out, is as robust as our measures and our sampling and our population. So again, I mentioned that we're going to talk more about balance. And here's a good way to think about creating a balance for our measures and our goals. And so we want to be able to have a fair and equitable financial score, customer, business process, and learning and growth. So think about that we need to have maybe a goal or a measure in each of these areas, so very similar to what you saw before. So we've designed our measures, we've looked at them, we've balanced them, and so now it's time to do some analysis. This is where the statistics come in, and we start to say, what kind of analysis would we want? Again, not going through a lot of our statistical pieces, but we want to start thinking about interpreting or doing an analysis. So are we really drawing the conclusions that we want to conclude? Analysis should help you answer questions. So answer those measures. Did we get better in those areas? We should look for patterns and trends. And we want to think about using these analysis techniques within our teams, within our peers, and definitely when we start to think about root cause. And so now we have started to design it, collect it, and started to do some analysis of it. Then what? How do we take data and turn it into information through analysis, but more importantly, how do we turn it into decision making and something useful that we can get out of it to be able to shift our performance? Well, to do this, we need to think about within our collection, is it valid? So in other words, how true was this data? Was this really representing our population? Was it reliable? So in other words, if I would collect it and someone else would look at it or test it, are we getting the same results? Is it sensitive? Can it detect small changes maybe in our sample or population? Is it specific? Is it usable, which is a huge one, to be able to say, can we even do anything with it? Recordability, in other words, can we even gather it? Does it make sense when we pull it out? And then last but not least, stratification. So how widespread is this? Is this something that we can assume can spread to other parts of our population? When we do analysis and data collection, we need to just check on the statistical rigor or the confidence in our data is really representing our population. So we need to at least look at our confidence interval. Now, this is not going to be something that you probably go in and say, what's our confidence interval in this? But we need to think about that are those results that we got by chance. So we don't want to and just go in and say, yeah, we're confident when our information doesn't really represent our sample, the outcomes of that, or even our population doesn't even really represent what we're trying to get at. We need to look at, if you're looking for studies, think of a study that has a confidence level of 95%. So maybe this is how to look at others studying as well. And these are represented usually as a p-value. So when you're in there looking at maybe evidence-based literature on some sort of program or some sort of practice, and you're saying, man, we'd like to do this, but did it really make a difference? You're looking for those that have a confidence interval really high in that 95, 100% p-value, and it's listed as a p, and it's usually listed as a 0.05 or a 0.01 value. So looking at those percentages or levels. Once we get the numbers and we've looked at it and said, yeah, it's representing and it's what we're expecting, you know, it's not necessarily what we were expecting, but we got what we planned on and they're true numbers, then we need to think about what to do with them after that. So there's 4 different things that we can do to handle numbers, and we are going to break these down independently and talk about each one. So this would be similar to, we've got it, we've collected it, it's true numbers, now what? The first thing that we can do is we can order our data. And we would look at maybe the things like frequency or rank, so how often. We may also look at the proportion, or are there 2 things that are similar, and what's the relationship with those? So for example, the length of wait time and satisfaction within our clinic, that would be a proportion, the relationship between those 2. So first thing we could do with our data is we could order it. The second thing we could do is we could start to do some averaging or measures of what we call central tendency. So I'm getting all statistical on you now. Most of us are familiar with a mean, which is an average. We could do that. But we also may want to look at the median or the rank order. What you want to think about doing with median is, are you at the 50th percentile or are you higher than that? So you'd say, maybe let's take all of our clinics in one particular group. Say it's rural clinics that are doing ophthalmology. You know, are we in the bottom half, or are we in the top half? Are we even in the 90th percentile? That would be the median. And then we may also want to look at our data and do a mode. So again, how frequent does this occur? So our mode of how often do they rank us a 4 or 5, that is a mode piece if we're looking at that. The third thing we can do is we can look at variability within our data. And the variability is around the average. So we have to gather the average, and then we say, are they tightly, scored around that, or is there really a lot of spread? And we think about maybe our grades, for example. Did everybody get a B, a B plus, or A minus, or did we have some all the way from a failing grade all the way to an A plus? That's variability. And so we look at the range, again, lowest to highest, but we would also look at what we call a standard deviation, and this is the spread of the distribution. So again, something simple as grades. Yes, there was variation around an average, but were there more around in the B minus, or were there more toward the opportunity for the A plus side? And so we're looking at that standard deviation or the spread of our data. This would be a great variability for looking at, for example, your patients with A1Cs above and below. So are we just barely below a 9, or are we barely above, or are majority of our patients really truly below? But there's a lot of spread in that. So it's anywhere from really low numbers to almost 9. And the last one, I promise, this throws out a little statistics for you, and I apologize. But the last thing that we can do is we can compare our data. There's 3 different main comparison statistical tests. And again, I'm not going to teach you these tests, but you need to know that there's a couple things that we can do. The first thing is we can compare ratios, and that's called a chi-square. So in other words, comparing rates between 2 groups. The other thing we can do is we can do a t-test, and these compare 2 sets of like things. So maybe males and females above A1C and below A1C. So that would be done in a t-test. And then last but not least, a regression analysis would be distribution for 2 different things in a relationship. So as I mentioned earlier, what's the relationship between wait times and satisfaction scores. And so you can compare those two different distributions or the relationship between those two completely different scores. So once you have had an opportunity to, again, collect and figure it out, what it is, how we want to measure it, you've measured it, collected it, you've analyzed it, and now we want to display it. There's several different display types of tools as well, but the big thing for your displaying is knowing your audience and how do they intend on using it. So as we go through some of these display tools, think about, yeah, I want to do that. That's one thing that I could do. And that fits for my audience, and it would fit with my information as well. So the first one is a run chart. Most common, we look for types of variation in it, so that's the why we would want to use it. You can also see a process over time. So if you have data points that are spread out over maybe months or weeks, this is a great tool to use to be able to display that information. It's also a great, quick, easy tool to see if there was change once we implemented an improvement. So, what was the before and the after, and where did you see it go in the direction that it was intended? There are control charts, and this control chart is just simply a run chart with boundaries. So think of it as the run chart is a bowling alley or a lane, and control charts put up some bumpers for you. It can be more sensitive than a run chart, because what we do when we get those control limits is we may actually tighten them up. So you see that their bumpers get really tight, that they fit in this narrow piece. And so we have an opportunity to look for how much variation do we change over time, but really quickly identify that resulted improvement. All in all, your measures and your population and your sampling and your data and your analysis and questions and everything should help you answer three really important questions. What is the current performance? What do we reveal in trends? And then what should we do in the future? What kind of action should be taken? So keep these three questions in mind. If you're presenting data that doesn't do these three things, where's your value in that data? And so we have an opportunity to think about maybe we should switch our measures or maybe even our analysis techniques. So with that, I want to say thank you. I appreciate your time with us today. And if you have any questions now or in the future, I would be happy to answer them via email or via my phone. So feel free to reach out to us or anybody on your Compass PTN team. And again, excited to share with you a little bit of information about process improvement, populations, sampling, and data techniques.